right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us in the first talk in Cornell's 2023 to 2024 Buddhist Studies virtual talk series on the theme of critical pedagogy in Buddhist studies. This series is going to run throughout the coming academic year, and if you haven't yet taken the time to look through the full list of talks, I do encourage you to do so now with the link in the chat. We've got some really wonderful talks coming up. It'd be wonderful to have you all along for the ride. So my name is Bruno Shirley, alongside ZK Payne. I'm one of this year's graduate student co-chairs for Cornell Society for Buddhist Studies. And so I have the very great privilege of welcoming you all and of introducing today's speaker. Before I do introduce Professor Berkwitz, since this is the first talk in our new 23-24 series, I wanted to also provide a little bit of background on this theme that we've chosen for this year, critical pedagogy. Graduate students at Cornell formed this society that hosts these talks in the beginning of 2022, which of course was a very auspicious year. And so we very rapidly needed to switch to this Zoom format that we now use. And one of our very first online talks later that same year was given by our own professor for Japanese religions, Jane Marie Law. And Professor Law chose to present not some new cutting edge research in progress, as we sort of just assumed all academics wanted to talk about all the time. She instead talked about a question that she felt was really perilously under-addressed in forums just like this. Why study Buddhism in a liberal arts education? Professor Law's question obviously stuck with many of us for several years, and we're really delighted that now we can devote this entire year's programming and the entire year's worth of talks really just to attempting to answer her question from a variety of different perspectives. And ultimately, I hope to heed her call that we do take such pedagogical concerns seriously. And so with that aim, we're extremely fortunate to have our opening talk in the series given by Dr. Stephen Berkwitz, who'll be asking why and how should we teach Buddhism, critical reflections on Buddhist studies pedagogy. So Professor Berkwitz is Professor and Chair of Religious Studies at Missouri State University. His research focuses on Sri Lankan Buddhist literature, touching on themes of history-making, colonialism, kingship, gender. But he also has a long-standing interest in Buddhist pedagogy. In a 2016 article, he talked about what he called textbook Buddhism as a distinctive form of the tradition. And he argued that we needed to, as specialists, increasingly reflect on how we're using textbooks in the classroom and helping students to read critically. And then more recently, last year, he co-edited with Ashley Thompson what might be called his own textbook, the Routledge Handbook of Theravada Buddhism, which has been out for some time now, and we're very fortunate to have it. So I'm so grateful to have Professor Berkwitz here with us today to share his further thoughts on why and how we should teach Buddhism. Professor Berkwitz has very kindly allowed us to record the session. If you're uncomfortable with your face appearing in that recording at all, feel free to keep your camera off. But otherwise, please do join me in welcoming Professor Berkwitz for his opening remarks in this talk series. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruno. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be speaking in this series, and I'm delighted that there are so many people here that are interested in what I have to say. So my talk I titled it, Why and How Should We Teach Buddhism? Critical Reflections on Buddhist Studies Pedagogy. And this is kind of bare bones. I have an outline of things I want to say. I don't have a PowerPoint. I suspect that some of the points that I might make resonate with Jane Marie Law's talk some years ago. But my interest here is to try and stir up some discussion and some reflection, and hopefully we'll all learn something. So my talk has basically 4 parts. I want to begin by discussing the differences between teaching and research. Then I'll move to looking at why we teach about Buddhism, which will transition into how we teach about Buddhism. And finally, I'll say some things that where I hope to connect this teaching with research. And I see this as a way to broaden the audiences for our research, as well as learning to speak more easily with students and scholars in other fields. I should say that my subtitle to this talk is Learning from My Own Mistakes. because I'm reflecting now on about 25 years of teaching Buddhism and other subjects in the classroom and increasingly online. So, to begin, teaching is different from research. This is a fairly obvious point, but I think this is a point that we often forget. The language study and research skills that many of us have developed do not translate that easily into a classroom. And my guess is most of us are not teaching doctoral students. And if we are teaching our undergraduates and our master's students as if they were mini PhDs, we are doing them a disservice. But as professors in Buddhist studies, or aspiring professors in Buddhist studies, we often find ourselves pulled in different directions. The textual and field research that we may do does not often translate that easily into a teaching environment. And aside from those of us who teach in a handful of doctoral granting institutions, and I'm not including myself in that, most of our teaching is done for non-specialist undergraduates. And I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind. Now, for example, it's difficult sometimes, I think, for us as specialists to choose good materials for our students to learn, or to use in their learning. And this can include choosing a textbook. And Bruno mentioned a piece that I wrote a few years ago about Buddhist Studies textbooks. But I think we need to ask ourselves, what do we want our students to learn? And I'm going to suggest here, and I'll repeat this throughout these talks or my comments, that I think we should teach them something more than Buddhism. The scholarly books that we write and review and often read usually make for poor course materials. They're too detailed and dense and expensive. On the other hand, textbooks are usually limited in their contributions to research. And I think this means that those of us who write books for teaching, that these books are sometimes looked down upon, even though they're still important and influential. I coined the phrase or the term textbook Buddhism because I see it as a distinctive tradition that exists in the imagination of scholars and authors like us. Textbook Buddhism, I think, presents us with a different, more coherent vision of what Buddhism really is. Now, this may not always be accurate, but it may be conducive to student learning. And one of the things I've noticed in reviewing or surveying a lot of key textual or textbook materials is that there's an underlying tension in a lot of them. Does the author highlight coherence in tradition or highlight diversity in Buddhism? Or can we do both? I think this is also a key question in our own teaching. Do we want to emphasize what makes Buddhism coherent and recognizable? Or do we want to emphasize all the differences that one can find? Now, I'd like to move on to ask the question, why do we teach Buddhism? Or put differently, why should anyone take a Buddhism class? Now, I think this is an uncomfortable question, but also a necessary question for us to ask ourselves. Buddhism classes are usually electives, and they may count towards a degree requirement, but I have not heard of many institutions where every student needs to take one. Aside from the institutional makeup of where we teach, do we really believe that everyone needs to take our Buddhism class? Now, if we don't, and I'll admit that I don't believe that, what can we do to make them want to take a Buddhism class? And what can we do so that they get something out of it? So here I'm suggesting that we try to match what we want to teach with what our students want to learn. What can our students learn when they study Buddhism? Obviously, and presumably, they'll learn something about Buddhist traditions around the world, and that's good. But can they learn something more than that? For example, what I would like to advocate, and what I try to do in my class, is to have my students learn something more about what it means to be human and use the resources in Buddhist traditions to help facilitate that goal. Buddhism is an interesting subject, to be sure. A lot of our students might feel the same way, but is it relevant to them? Now, unless you are teaching in a Buddhist majority country, my guess is that you are like me and that most of your students are not Buddhists themselves. And we also should keep in mind that an increasing number of college-age students have fairly negative views about religion as a whole. So why take a course in Buddhism? Buddhism is an important aspect of the history and civilization of Asia, and that's, I think, inarguable. I recall hearing Charlie Hallisey once make the point that if it wasn't for Buddhism, there would be no Asia. And in a sense, I tend to agree with that. But that's usually not enough justification to get students interested in a Buddhism course. And surely that's not enough to sustain an entire semester or quarters long time of work. Buddhist philosophy contains interesting ideas that many students like to reflect on: karma, rebirth, emptiness, and so forth. But there are other philosophical systems that include interesting subjects as well. So Buddhism is not alone here. I think we need to reflect, or perhaps remind ourselves, that the subject of Buddhism is more fascinating to us than it is to our students. And just because we are interested in it, and we have devoted years of study and perhaps teaching in the field, doesn't mean that students automatically have the same excitement for it that we do. And so I think I would suggest that we ask our students, why are you taking a course in Buddhism? What is it that you want to learn? What I've increasingly felt important for my teaching is to try to emphasize how the subject is relevant to the lives of my students, and that it'll be somehow connected with their broader interests. Now, this means that I have gradually shifted the focus away from a detailed historical development of Buddhism, of a clear-cut or kind of intensive analysis of sectarian differences, largely because I found that those sections of the course have not really interested my students. But when I give more attention to relatable issues that Buddhists themselves have sought to address over time, then my students get more interested. They're more responsive to what I have to say. A nice corollary of this approach is that Buddhists become less exotic and more relatable as human beings. And so I've increasingly find myself teaching things that don't emphasize the distinctiveness or otherness of Buddhism, but more how Buddhism can relate to a variety of ethical thought and choices, human concerns and behaviors, expressions of beauty and entertainment, attempts to deal with important life issues such as death. And so what I want my students to come away with in a class period, much less the entire class, is that Buddhists are people too. They're not a completely different kind of human being. They're people like us with whom students can relate and learn something from. I think the problems in teaching a Buddhism course are different than what most of us expect. I think scholars typically are concerned with avoiding reifying or overgeneralizing Buddhism. And this leads us to emphasize its diversity. And that is okay, but there's a danger that we emphasize the differences to such a degree that students don't feel like they've really understood what Buddhism is. Doing justice to Buddhism's diversity and incongruities doesn't always do justice to our students. And so I do think there's a need to meet them where they're at. I know, speaking for myself, that in the beginning part of my career, I worried more about misrepresenting Buddhism than I did about confusing or boring my students. And this is a hard lesson to learn. But again, we're not speaking to specialist colleagues when we teach an undergraduate course in Buddhism. The goal, I think, ought to be giving our students somewhere to start learning about Buddhism and not feeling like we have to finish that journey for them, teach them everything they need to know. So what I'm suggesting is that the key issue in teaching Buddhist studies is how to make the subject interesting and accessible to our students. And this can be a challenge, more challenging than we might think, because we've already spent many years studying Buddhism. We're interested in it. We figured out some things along the way. Our students aren't like us. At least most of our students aren't like us, not yet. So we might ask, how do Buddhist traditions shape people's lives and cultures? How do Buddhist practices and institutions respond to and intersect with other areas of human life? You might ask, what makes North Americans interested in Buddhism, even though not all of them are? Can we engage these student interests and not just disabuse them, which I think is the tendency we learn from our doctoral programs? And I was reminded recently that it's not always good to be a killjoy or a wet blanket when it comes to teaching Buddhism. I might tell a short story to kind of illustrate this point. Last spring, my department hosted the Midwest American Academy of Religion meeting. And in between one of the sessions, I was having a conversation with the spouse of a colleague who is a retired minister. And he was really excited to tell me about what he had learned about the Bodhisattva, and that how this figure seemed to be an admirable example of someone who is so selfless that they would postpone their own enlightenment to save all other beings. And my response was something to the effect of, well, that's how that's described in text, but not always in practice. And that I think I even said that we could think of it as a kind of pre-modern version of virtue signaling. And this friend of mine looked at me with his mouth open and said, "Fuck you, Steve." I apologize for my language, but I think it proves an important point. I was making what he thought was so interesting about Buddhism and just snatching it away. It's hard as specialists not to try to correct misconceptions or to add alternative perspectives to common viewpoints. But we really don't always have to refine and correct what people say about Buddhism. Now, of course, there's still room for giving nuance and correcting some really blatant misconceptions that our students might have. But at the same time, I think I've learned that I need to be selective and mindful about what students want to learn. I know that I can't teach everything about Buddhism in one term. And sometimes it's enough just to say, well, there are different views on that. Ultimately, I think our job, or at least let me say, ultimately my job, is to generate an interest in students to want to learn more about Buddhism. I want to equip them with the skills to learn and critically appraise different sources of knowledge and not feel that I'm the one that has to give them everything they need to know about Buddhism. Now, in section 3 here, I want to say that our choices in the courses we teach matter. So how we teach about Buddhism is really important and something to reflect on. We're presented with several choices when we begin to teach a class on Buddhism. Where do we begin? Do we begin in ancient India? Do we begin with the birth of the Buddha, the rise of the early Sangha, maybe a different historical event, or perhaps even the present day? I don't know if there's a right answer here, but our decision on where we start talking about Buddhism or where we start telling the story of Buddhism will have a major impact on how our students understand it. What do we cover? Do we try to cover a geographical expanse with as many different regions as possible? Do we give a historical survey of the tradition? Do we highlight issues and debates within Buddhist traditions? Do we cover what we think students should know about Buddhism? And if so, does that come at the expense of what they want to know about Buddhism? Now, what do we use when we teach? Do we use textbooks and or primary texts? I usually use a combination. Scholarly works, which I typically don't use. There are films and videos, which I use in a sort of limited measure. Do we go on temple visits or museum visits? Something I wish I could do, but I really can't where I am. Do we use websites? Now, all of these sources that we might deploy to teach Buddhism require some care and thought. But the sources themselves don't matter as much, I believe, as how we present them and how we talk about them. We can use a fairly problematic written source and still use it to great effect in teaching about Buddhism, and as well as teaching about how others write about Buddhism. How do we want to organize our material? Do we do it chronologically? Do we do it culturally, by Buddhist school? Do we highlight certain issues such as gender, material culture, and so forth? And also, whose voices are heard? Do we teach Buddhism from a scholar's perspective as opposed to a practitioner's perspective? Do we give the viewpoint of a monastic elite versus an ordinary layperson? Do we talk about historical authorities or contemporary practitioners? Now, I think for me, deploying a range or variety of different voices is something that I try to do in my class. But these are things that we need to be conscious about when we make those decisions. There are also pedagogical issues when we teach Buddhism. I think we ought to consider not only what students will learn, which is what we think about when we select our sources, but also how they will learn. What kinds of assignments or exams are conducive to student learning? Some of us may wish to experiment with ungrading to lower the stakes of information recall. This semester, I'm allowing my students to retake some quizzes. And this was inspired by a talk I heard by an educator named James Lang, whose book, Small Teaching, is fantastic, and I recommend it to all instructors. It includes materials, or I guess ideas really, of short, simple activities that can be added to your existing course to help increase how students learn and recall information. Because after all, that's what we want them to do. Another thing I decided to do years ago, and this was inspired by one of my graduate instructors, Jerry Larson, is to use creative projects to let students think creatively and deeply about what they're learning about Buddhism. This could be making a painting, this could be writing a poem or a story or something like that. This is not some incredibly innovative pedagogical method, to be sure. But what I've found is that students really respond to it. And they think about it, they learn something, they get more out of the course when they apply their knowledge in a kind of hands-on, creative way. There's different methods we can also use. Videos can be memorable and effective for learning. They can be used to raise issues and spur conversations. I tend to think that they can be overdone, and I sometimes struggle in finding video sources that I think are good and make the points that I want them to make. But I think definitely there's something that are helpful. Examining case studies can be useful to probe key issues more deeply. And here I think it's useful to attend to issues of broader human concern: anti-racism, poverty, sexism, issues that our students might be thinking about or affected by themselves. We could bring in guest speakers or make visits to temples to decenter the instructor's so-called expert voice. And I think it's useful to show that Western scholars are not the only or the final authorities when it comes to teaching Buddhism. One thing I also like to do, and I've done for many years now, is include what we might call a popular book by a Western Buddhist to illustrate how Buddhism becomes adapted in a culture in which a lot of us teach, or at least I teach. And I want to share briefly something I did the last time I taught my Buddhism course, and that is I assigned Karen Darris's book, Storied Companions, which is another book that I can't recommend highly enough. She basically presents a story. Why I used her book, Storied Companions, as another sort of biography, or more specifically, autobiography, to juxtapose with some other sources that I use, such as the Buddha Charita and the Life of Milarepa. But Karen Darris's story, and Karen is an old friend of mine, is a really moving account of her own efforts to use the Buddhist narratives to help cope with some of the trauma and challenges that she has felt in her life. And my students, upon reading this, were as blown away by her story as I was. And it was a really effective tool to get them to think about Buddhism as something that they themselves can relate to. And kind of connected with that, I would pose a question: do students learn more from Buddhist literature than Buddhist sutras? And I guess I would have to say, I tend to think they do. I think the stories present a more appealing, more sort of dynamic way of talking about Buddhist ideas. And again, it's something that I think students can relate to a little bit better than some doctrinal works. Now, I do include some doctrinal works, but I try to use more narratives than that. Now, I think Buddhism as a subject is something that can matter to people, but we shouldn't assume that it does. I think it matters more when it enters into realms that students can imagine and experience on their own. And it acquires greater significance to them when it is related to the ways that humans organize and evaluate their own lives. Now, we can still connect teaching in this way to our research in productive ways, but I suggest that we move from teaching to research rather than from research to teaching. They do not have to be diametrically opposed, of course, but when we think about research in the same way that we think about teaching, we might present our work in ways that are more comprehensible and influential to other people, including specialists. I think it's an important question to ask, or an important question to ask is, why should anyone care about my research? Why would anyone want to read my book or my article? And here I think it's useful to address this question intentionally and try to relate our research to a wider intellectual community. I can also speak to this as a series editor for a Routledge book series. It's important to publish for more than a few specialist colleagues. We'd all like to have our books widely read, cited even, but in order to do that, we need to make it accessible and interesting to a wider audience. Now, Bruno mentioned in his very kind intro about a book that Ashley Thompson and I edited, the Routledge Handbook of Theravada Buddhism. And I want to say a few things about this because it relates to my advocacy for teaching in a more broad-based way. Now, we organized this volume to relate to broader issues as they relate, or as they've found in Theravada Buddhism. The chapters are arranged thematically rather than geographically or chronologically. And we wanted to do this to show that the subjects are relevant to different parts of the Buddhist world, and in some cases to non-Buddhist worlds as well. There are 4 parts to the volume. Part 1 is ideas, ideals. Part 2, practices, persons. Part 3, texts, teachings. And Part 4, images and imaginations. And in organizing the volume in this way, Ashley and I wanted to organize it in ways that are not unique to Buddhism. We wanted to encourage thinking about Theravada or Buddhist traditions in general in ways that invite boundary crossing, to cross boundaries with other forms of Buddhism, with other religions, and maybe even other areas of human existence and experience. We did not limit ourselves or the essays to particular geographical areas or historical eras. We talk about attempting to balance the nominalist and realist dimensions of Theravada Buddhism, but I think this applies to Buddhism in general. And by nominalist, we mean the definitions and evaluations of the tradition as a whole. And this can come from both inside and outside of the tradition. So what people think Theravada is. Now, the realist dimension refers to the diversity found among different expressions of what is nominally a singular Buddhist tradition. Scholars and Buddhist practitioners themselves frequently hold both of these dimensions in an unstable tension. And again, this reflects back to one of my opening comments about the tension between coherence and diversity. We can find authoritative traditions and singular conceptions, but these are always qualified by multiple interpretations, expressions, and voices. So approaching this particular work was something we did in a way that mirrors, I think, how I now approach my classes. So I'd like to advocate that we teach Buddhism in a similar way, that we can underline how there are different competing and also compatible ways to define and practice Buddhism, but that we also emphasize aspects that cannot be said to be unique to the tradition, to make Theravada in this case, or Buddhism in general, something that is so different from every other religious experience or religious tradition. And I think we can do this by relating Buddhist concerns to human concerns more generally. And this, I find, makes it more interesting and relatable to my students. So to conclude, I think it falls upon us to make a persuasive case for teaching Buddhism. Set aside the economic issues or institutional priorities and all of those things that can make our jobs a little bit more difficult and fraught. We really need to convince students that taking a course on Buddhism is something that will benefit them. I suggest that we identify the value of teaching Buddhism. And this can be done when we relate it to larger issues of human concern and societal relevance. So Buddhism, I think, can be valuable. It's worth learning about because it can relate to things that are of wider human concern. And Buddhists have particular responses and approaches to those concerns that are interesting and worth learning about in detail. Now, I don't see this as a betrayal or a compromise to Buddhist studies. Instead, I think it can underline how Buddhism is intimately related to all of us as human actors. This, of course, doesn't mean that we're all Buddhists, but learning about Buddhism is another way of learning about what it means to be a human being. And students can respond. I find that they frequently respond quite enthusiastically to the idea that they share many of the same concerns that Buddhist authors have shared or have expressed. So let's enable our students and ourselves to engage others in conversation on important matters about which Buddhism has something to say. It's not something that is unique to the tradition, but it is something that Buddhists have also contributed to throughout time and space. So ultimately, I guess what I'm arguing for is an attempt to try to make Buddhism seem meaningful and even perhaps a little relatable to students. And that learning about Buddhism entails learning about something more than just Buddhism. We can learn and reflect on how people organize their existence, build and maintain relationships with others, how they find value and purpose in their lives, how they negotiate power relations and identities, among many other things. Now, all of these things, of course, are not unique to Buddhism, but they are things that I think students are interested to learn about, and they benefit by thinking about them in detail. So in conclusion, I guess, if students can learn about Buddhism and something more than just Buddhism in our class, then I think we've done a good job. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. That was a really wonderful talk and a really wonderful opening to the rest of our series. If it is our job as educators to get people interested in learning more, then you've done some good education, on me at least. So as Tyler's written in the chat earlier, we do have some time for questions. If you have got questions, you're welcome to use the hand raise function in Zoom. You can also type questions directly into the chat window or the little Q&A window. And we have got a question in the Q&A from David Collins. David, would you like me to read this out, or are you happy to unmute and speak yourself?
I'm glad to speak. Thanks for the presentation. My question is perhaps not too unusual. I've got a clinical psychology doctorate and studies in Buddhist practices, traditions, and in my training, advisors in each field who were pretty sure I belonged in the other field, because my interest is in the actual practices, the experiences that mean most to people in their lives. Mindfulness, of course, these days is pretty popular, especially in psychotherapeutic applications. What is your view of the role of incorporating contemplative and meditative practices in studies of Buddhism in the academia?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's a good one. Yeah, I teach a course on Buddhism, and I also teach a separate course on yoga and meditation. And in that course, I arrange for students to have the option of engaging in some actual practices related to yoga and mindfulness and Tai Chi and things like that. Not by me, because I don't feel very qualified to teach that, but by other people who do that for a living. I think that there is a role for incorporating contemplative practices in a course. Now, I don't know that it's always an easy thing to do. And to be honest, I haven't tried integrating that in a sustained way in any of my courses. I know that there are some people who have, and I believe that even one of the talks in this series later will address that directly. You know, I think as long as there is a good rationale that you can convey to students about why this is something that is appropriate for the course and how they can get something out of it, I think that's a laudable kind of segment of a course to include. Again, I haven't tried to do that in any sustained way, so I don't have any advice about that. But I'd say sure, if that's something that can kind of help students relate to the material better, to make it something that they learn about and maybe even embody in a deeper way. I think that can only be something that's good.
Thank you. I'll tie real quickly. Anecdote. I worked in a staff position for a couple of decades at a major university, state university, and was regularly asked by the psychology department to teach meditation, sometimes in the sociology department, once in the business school, and never in the religious studies department. There are issues. And a further little footnote I'd offer is, when we do incorporate contemplative practice, I feel pretty strongly that one, is profoundly valuable, but two, that we have recourse for them to receive support if stuff comes up in their experience. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Good points.
And then Joseph?
Hi, thanks, Stephen. Mine is less of a question. I guess it's kind of a comment. What you started out by saying that there's a difference between teaching and research, and we have to kind of address what students want. And about 25 years ago, I got really frustrated with Buddhism textbooks and textbook treatments of Buddhism, a lot of which there's a lot of stuff out there that's just intellectually irresponsible. So as a response to that, I just started teaching my research in every class. So my intro to religion, I'm teaching my research. And so I'll have a class of 30 students, none of which are religion majors, about half of which have never taken a humanities course before. And what I use for Intro to Buddhism is I use Sutta Central, and I'll put the English of a sutta up and then the Pali next to it, walk them through the terminology. If the Chinese is different, I'll put that over there. But you can do it in a way that it doesn't freak them out. And what I try to do and how I engage the students is by talking about things that are really concrete. State formation, 2nd century BCE, what else was going on when these things were being written, and how do these sutras address the larger political historical context. And I found that if I talk about concrete things and that Buddhist writings are a rational response to things that need to get done, that gives students a way in and they understand it. So Buddhism is not foreign, it's more understandable because it's dealing with things that everybody has to deal with. And then, my intro to Buddhism, I start out with the Pali Canon, and then we end with the Vietnam War. And we talk about ways that Buddhism was used rhetorically by the Viet Cong, by, all the different parties involved in the war, and how it's used to kind of leverage political goodwill. And so always tying Buddhism to something concrete, even though none of my students have ever had any exposure to Buddhism before and will probably never take anything after that, I can tell from their exams that they understand not only the diversity of Buddhism, but they understand why different Buddhist positions are taken up, and they get it. So I don't think that we have to back away from, I don't think that undergraduate Buddhism or textbook Buddhism needs to be different than what Buddhists are doing. I think that we should have the Buddhism that we teach actually get closer to what Buddhists are doing. Because a lot of what I see in textbook Buddhism is kind of a creation that comes out of colonialism. And it really kind of it leaves Buddhists behind. So that's my concern about having a strong split between teaching and research. Anyway, that was my comment.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Joseph. I think I tend to agree with a lot of what you have said, and I applaud you for being able to take that kind of approach in your classroom and to make it work and have students respond positively to that. I think one of the things that stood out to me in your comments is that concreteness of the material that you present is something that students can kind of get their minds around, and that they can maybe relate to other aspects of experience. And that's one of the important points that I wanted to try to make, is that if we're teaching Buddhism as something that is thoroughly integrated with other aspects of existence, then that's something that I think students will respond more positively to. So in that regard, I again, I applaud you for doing what you're doing. I do think that there is, the teaching and research, again, don't have to be diametrically opposed. I think that if some of us have figured out a way to translate what we're doing in our research to sort of beginning students of Buddhism, and to make it so that they're not overwhelmed, or they find something that they find relatable or worth thinking about, then I think that works great. I actually wanted to try to emphasize that the way we approach teaching a course can also affect the way we write and publish. And if we do that, it becomes even that much easier to incorporate research into our classes. I haven't encountered very many books that were revised dissertations that would work very well in a classroom. But I do think that, again, I'd actually like to see, and I suppose I could go so far as to say I'm calling for an attempt by scholars in Buddhist studies to write and publish things that do speak to larger issues and that can be used in a classroom, but also might be read by the general public in some cases.
Monica?
Good afternoon, everyone. Just chiming on to that last comment, Stephen, I really appreciate it. Just for some context, I work at Harvard Divinity School, and I teach on both sides of the fence between academic study of religion and theological education. I'm also a Buddhist chaplain and minister by training, and a Buddhist practical theologian, if that's even a thing, which some days I doubt. So just chiming on to that, I think there is an audience out there that maybe Buddhist studies hasn't been thinking about for a while, and it's mostly the students that I teach and the students who are in other theological education programs, which now amount to a few hundred every year, both in North America and in Europe. So when Buddhist studies academics are thinking, well, who could possibly be the audience for this? Well, you're already thinking about this in relation to your undergraduate courses that you're teaching, as Stephen and Joseph and others have so ably demonstrated. But also there's a whole other vocation out there that would gladly, hungrily read these books, we're stuck in this place where the books that they sell at Barnes and Noble, kind of the trade paperbacks, are too rudimentary and not specific enough for the graduate students. And yet the books that come out of Buddhist studies and the articles and things, they're written by PhDs for PhDs. So that's a little bit too far. My students might have spent more time studying trauma theory than Indian philosophy, so they maybe can't follow that conversation because they needed to learn this other thing. So there is a middle here that is missing in the literature. So for example, right now I'm teaching a class on Buddhist spiritual formation. There's exactly one book about that topic, what we would call secondary literature that analyzes some of the primary sources. And I can only use like 3 or 4 chapters from it because of, how they're written for Buddhist studies majors. But when I look at some of my colleagues' classes where they're teaching on things like Buddhism and trauma, grief, chronic illness, because of the dialogue that those fields have with psychology, there's a tremendous amount of secondary literature that they can draw from. So there are models of how this can be done, and done very well and successfully. So I just want to encourage any Buddhist studies scholars on the call, if you're thinking who would ever read this? There are several thousand Buddhist professionals and students now who very much need this work, but it needs to come from the Buddhist studies scholars because they're out there in the world doing their work as chaplains and psychologists and so on. So please, please, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Can I follow up? I mean, it's really interesting to hear about your experience at Harvard and the students that you're working with. Could I ask you to follow up a little bit about what kinds of works you sort of think would fit that particular audience?
Yeah, well, Stephen, every subject that you named in your talk as things that your undergraduates are interested in would be relevant and probably doesn't have quite enough written about it. And if it is written, it's in a kind of a self-help type genre trade paperback. And those can be wonderful, but we're talking about a group of people who are training to become professional caregivers, chaplains, therapists, nonprofit leaders, advocates. So they're not studying these topics to apply to their own lives, which is the audience those trade paperbacks are written for. They're becoming caregivers and leaders, right? So it's a slightly different perspective, like not how do I cope with my chronic illness? How do I support someone else who's coping with their chronic illness? How do I help someone else who's, trying to advocate against systemic racism in a particular political context? Buddhism has a tremendous amount to teach about that. So there's this missing middle between Buddhist studies outputs and trade paperback outputs. So there's this big gap that people could be writing into. And it doesn't mean you have to become a specialist on chaplaincy or advocacy or something, but I think of Maria Heim's work on the emotions, some of the stuff she's done around grief and how grief shows up in the Pali Canon and the Parinirvana Sutta. Stuff like that is tremendously useful, where it cites sources, it talks about philosophy, it talks about doctrine, but it's very relevant to the lived experience of everyday people.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. Thank you, Monica. I think that's a really helpful and important point to make, and it's probably something more of us ought to be addressing too. Certainly would help sell some books too, right?
I should do my hosting duties and interject here and say we are coming up on our time, but for those who are interested in this particular avenue of conversation, Monica will be giving a talk later in this same talk series in February, I believe it is. So this is my plug to keep coming back for more of these sessions and to continue this conversation, hopefully over the course of the entire year. For now, if anyone does want to stay on the line a little longer, and if you have more time, Steve, you're very welcome to. But for now, I just ask you to join me all before you leave in thanking Professor Berkwitz for his remarks today and thanking all of you for your attention, participation, and questions.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to stick around a little longer if anyone wants to talk.